Our Bible study today is on Daniel chapter 7, beginning at verse 1. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, as Daniel was given the vision of the four beasts, as this apocalyptic dream helped him to see what was coming and what would happen to the people of Israel, we know that you also gave him a vision of hope, the same hope that we have, the vision of the Son of Man. May we always be encouraged as we face trials and tribulations in this world, knowing that you are for us and not against us, and that your great love by sending the Son of Man, your Son Jesus, is the reason why we know that nothing can ever separate us from your love in Christ Jesus. Amen. Okay. So in the sheet that I handed out, we have some more preliminary information. So the background information, we can realize as we start reading it that it mentions Belshazzar, right? And he had just been wiped out in chapter 6 by Darius, which we talked about is also Cyrus the Great. So the chapter that talked about Belshazzar was chapter 5. So in essence, chapter 7 takes place before chapter 5, right? So why is it backwards? And it has to do with the way that the book was put together. For the first, remember the first chapter of Daniel was Hebrew, and then we're going to see that chapters 8 through 12 are also in Hebrew, but then the middle chapters 2 through 7 are Aramaic. Aramaic is a language that the Persians spoke. It used Hebrew letters, but it was a different language that had different rules of grammar. It's kind of like, like English and Spanish use similar, almost the same letters. And then, of course, just because they use the same letters, same alphabet, doesn't mean they're the same language, right? So that's the same thing with Aramaic and Hebrew. And the Hebrew, of course, was Jewish, and so he was writing this so that the people of Israel might be strengthened in their in the knowledge that God was watching over them. And then, of course, the Aramaic was the official language of the Babylonian Empire at the time, as well as the Persian Empire. But also, most of the Jewish people spoke Aramaic at this time as well. And in fact, they continued speaking Aramaic all the way into the 1st century A.D., right? So Jesus spoke Aramaic, even though he knew how to read Hebrew, because obviously when he went inside the synagogue, it says that they handed him the scroll of Isaiah, and he looked at it and he read it, and he said, "Today it's fulfilled in your hearing." So we know he knew Hebrew. But he also spoke Greek because there was a lot of Greek-speaking Romans. So the Greek language was used by the Romans as the official language at the time. Eventually, Latin took over as the official language of the Roman Empire by the end of the 3rd century. And that's when the Bible was translated for the first time into Latin by a man named Jerome. And it was used as the official Bible for Christians, especially in the Catholic Church, from the 3rd century AD all the way until 1962, when the Catholic Church finally said, okay, we don't have to use Latin anymore in our worship services and in our Bibles. I mean, people still were reading translations and stuff, but it's amazing that Latin lasted that long. But Persian lasted a lot longer than the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was destroyed by the Greeks in the 300s, but the language persisted for another 400 years. Okay, so if we realize that the middle section is in Aramaic is kind of like an official language for the empires at the time, in essence, it's kind of written so that those people who could understand that language would have access to what God was saying, right? So this chapter here, chapter 7, is the first of the apocalyptic chapters. Right, before this, we had narratives, right? Stories about Daniel in the lion's den, the 3 men in the fiery furnace, stuff like that. Those are narratives, historical narratives. But now we're getting into apocalyptic prophecy. And so this one is kind of like, it's an ending to the Aramaic section, and it's also kind of a preview to the Hebrew section of the visions that are coming after it. So it kind of takes, and so it's not chronological because the author, Daniel, is trying to, he's using something called a chiasm. So a chiasm is a very common structural way of writing in the Hebrew Bible. And so the easiest way of understanding it is it's named after the letter chi in the Greek language, which is really it's an X, right? You've seen the X with a P on it, which is actually the letter R, so the chi-rho. Yeah, so it's called chiasm because it's like if you take half of the X, then you have kind of like an arrow, right? And it's the first section of a narrative is parallel to the last section. So first and last, second and last, and then the third part in the middle is kind of like forms like an arrow, and that's usually the most important part. So if this is the end of a section that's supposed to reflect something that started in the beginning of this Aramaic section. So notice that chapter 2 and chapter 7 are the first and last sections of the Aramaic section. So that means chapter 2 has a lot to do with chapter 7. What did we read about in chapter 2 of Daniel? Yeah, we had Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And what did he dream about? The great statue. And it was made out of 4 main sections, 4 materials. I guess, technically when you get to the iron legs, and then there was the clay feet. But says it was clay mixed with iron, so it's still kind of four main sections, right? So the 4 main materials of the great statue are paralleled with the 4 beasts in this chapter. So we'll read about those and talk about what those refer to coming up. But if we were to date this, it would most likely be around 550 BC, which is the time, as that was the end of the Babylonian Empire, with Belshazzar, being the final ruler. And remember, he was like he was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and his father had left him in charge and had moved his capital to Teman, which is in Arabia, and kind of, abandoned. I mean, he wasn't there in person to rule Babylon, and so Belshazzar was more like a governor. He wasn't like a ruler of the whole area because he didn't really do anything except for rule in the city of Babylon. But this is before his fall, the chapter 5 talked about, and so around 550, he has this vision, and of all the things that you might imagine, he's told that he's not supposed to share this, or at least we're going to read that he keeps it to himself. So why does he have to keep it to himself? Well, chapter 2 was more of a public thing because the king had the vision and he just interpreted it. Now this one is going to have similar things, because we're going to talk about the comparing and contrasting, but the things that are different are obviously not for the king Nebuchadnezzar or for the Babylonian Empire. They're specifically for Daniel's comfort and for his writing these things down so that the people of God would be able to read it and they would find comfort. Because just imagine, if you had been in exile your whole life, because remember Daniel was a teenager in Daniel chapter 1, and now in Daniel chapter 7, it's at the end of the Babylonian Empire and he's in his 80s already, right? And by the time the Persians take over, he's only alive for another 8 years, and he dies around 88, and now the Persian Empire is in control. So, but he wrote this at the end of his life, and he wrote about all the stuff that happened to him. But now he's about to die. He's spent his whole life in exile. And just imagine, how do you feel if you were taken from your homeland and lived your whole life in a foreign land? Wondering, has God forgotten us? Does he even care about us? It would be pretty demoralizing. But he didn't lose his faith, and that's the important thing, because his faith carried him through this, and what he writes down is going to help the faith of all who came after him. And not just the people of Israel who returned to Jerusalem, because after his lifetime, the first wave of returnees, exiles, came home to Jerusalem, and that was Ezra and Nehemiah. But it's also for us, because in a lot of ways, we are exiles, and we're on our way journey home as well. Where is our promised land? That's right, heaven. And so we're in the wilderness of Babylon right now. The world is Babylon, and we're captives here. But remember, it says in 1 Peter, we are not citizens here. We're not citizens here. Heaven is our home. It's just like the song, right? And we're going to our promised land, and we have been released. So Daniel gives the hope to the returnees, and Jesus then is foreshadowed by Daniel as the one who gives hope to us who are on our way home to heaven. There's also a parallel to this and Exodus, right? So Moses led the people out of Egypt to the promised land. Daniel led the people out of Babylon back. I mean, he didn't personally lead them back, but he prepared them for going back to the promised land. And then Jesus, of course, is going to do it on the greatest level possible, which is not only physically from a place of exile, but spiritually from the place of exile in our sin to the everlasting home of heaven, where there will, as it says in Revelation 21, there will no longer be any crying or death or illness. All these things shall pass away. So it's a beautiful picture. The whole Bible is, it starts with the story of the Exodus out of Egypt. Daniel is doing something similar, and then Jesus does the final stage of that. So in some ways, you can even see that as a chiasm, right? With Moses at the beginning of the Bible, and Jesus at the end of the Bible, and then Daniel in the very middle, and then his vision of the Messiah is right in the middle of this chapter. So this is kind of the highlights. As you look at the questions I have to consider, you can see number 4, I mentioned about how is the vision of the Son of Man the real highlight of this chapter. Okay, and let me just look at some of the other points I have here. The purpose of this private revelation is for the encouragement of the saints. So Daniel mentions in chapter 7, verse 28, jump ahead, this is the end of the very last verse. It says, "This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself." So, he says he kept it to himself, but he did write it down. I think in verse 1 it says that he wrote this down. But after his death, the scroll was passed down so that people could take it with him and read about it and find out about what God had revealed to him. And then, of course, there's several places in verse 18, 21, 22, 25, and 27, which he specifically says, this vision is for the saints. What does the word saint mean? Do you remember when I've talked about that before?
Holy.
Very good, yeah. The word saint in Greek and Hebrew, it just means holy ones. It's translated as saints because the Greek word for holy is sanctus, right? So saints are holy ones, literally holy ones. And what does holy mean?
Without sin.
That's right, set apart. It means to be set apart. So you're set apart from the world. You're not just like everybody else. You're not a child of under the control of sin, death, and the devil. Now you're a child of God. And we're set apart for service to the Lord. We don't just serve ourselves, but we serve God and our neighbor. We're set apart in the way that we live our lives, right? So we don't just live like everybody else and just work 7 days a week. We serve the Lord, and we set apart a day to serve, to worship our God. So to be a holy one doesn't mean that you're sinless or you're perfect. It means that you are made that way because of God, right? God is the one who makes us saints, right? So unlike in the Catholic current theology, which actually started around 500 AD, where they started to, in the beginning of the whole idea, they called it the cult of the saints. It's something that it wasn't like that originally, but what happened is, like, after the Roman Empire stopped persecuting Christians, a lot of people thought if you died for your faith, that's like a one-way ticket to heaven. Well, then nobody was dying anymore because the Roman Empire became Christian, and if there's no more people being martyred how could you have a better chance of getting to heaven? If you can't be martyred to get to heaven, then maybe you can go visit a martyr, a place where he died. And so then, pieces of the bodies of martyrs were like bought and sold. That's what like the, not the indulgences, what were they called? During the Reformation, there was kings who were collecting all these, there we go, the relics. The relics, and Luther's joke was that there were so many splinters of the true cross all over Europe that it could have made up the whole ark. Right? And so everybody claimed they had a splinter of the true cross during the Middle Ages because everybody wanted to have relics. Because going to a place where there was a relic, like there's the finger of St. Peter you can find at a church, and then there's the hand of St. Jerome and whatever. I mean, they always had pieces of saints. I never had a whole one. There was a couple of places that might have had whole ones, but that was a misunderstanding of what it meant to be a saint, as if they were better people and then they earned more grace, more than they needed to get to heaven, so that the church was kind of like a bank, so that if this guy died with extra grace, then by praying to him, he can give you some of that grace, but only through the church, though, because the church would sell you that grace with an indulgence, and so it got out of hand.
Isn't that the way purgatory started?
Yeah, well, purgatory, and I think it was around 1000. One of the popes interpreted a passage from the book of Maccabees, where some people died in the battle against the Greek Empire, and they came to bury their bodies, and they found that they had little idols in their pockets, and then they were like, oh, they can't go to heaven if they were worshiping idols, and so they prayed for these people who died. And then the Pope said, well, if they're praying for people who were Israelites who had died, but they're not in heaven, then obviously they must have believed that they had a chance to get to heaven. So where were they? They're not in hell. They're not in heaven. And so they said, they'll call it purgatory. Yeah. It's the waiting room for heaven.
And Dante Alighieri popularized the whole thing.
Yes.
About 1100 AD.
That's right, yeah. And so Dante, the Italian writer, he came up with 3 books, and they're actually all in poetry, right? So, and there's the book on in the Inferno about hell, and there's the one on purgatory, and then the divine, and then heaven. And he called it the Divine Comedy because there was all these 3 places. And this guy takes a journey through each of the levels, through hell, through purgatory, and
When was
finally,
that
1100 AD. Yeah, so it was written right after the time when the popes made purgatory a doctrine. Okay, so so the whole point I'm trying to make is that Daniel mentions the saints several times, because the saints are God's people, and those people who were who were left in exile, he was telling them God hasn't forgotten you, and that's true for us. God has not forgotten us. And we know that because he sent his son Jesus. If God did not withhold his own son, but gave her up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, give us all things? As Paul writes, and I'm not sure which book that is it Galatians or something? But it's an important verse that reminds us of how much God loves us. Okay, so really, the center of this chapter is, the first part of the chapter, he gives us the 4 beasts, and then the last part of the chapter, he gives us the interpretation of the 4 beasts, and smack dab in the middle, just like a chiasm does. So even though this chapter is like the end of a larger chiasm of the Aramaic section, the chapter itself is a chiasm. So you got the introduction of the 4 beasts, the interpretation of the 4 beasts, and right in the middle, that's the key to the chapter, which is chapter 7, verse 14. Right? And so we'll just jump ahead real quick. Who in verse 13 and 14, that's the center of the book. And who is it talking about when it says, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And then it goes on about how he approached the throne of the Most High. In verse 14, he was given authority and glory and power. All peoples and nations and men of every language worshipped him. And his dominion will last forever. Who is that?
Jesus.
That's right, it's Jesus. And how do we know it's Jesus? Because there's 4 things that are described about this Son of Man that are characteristics that only God can have. And if you try to say this is an angel or some other person, then that can't be right, because the Bible's clear that there's only one God. In Deuteronomy it says, "Behold, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." So we should only, and it says you should only worship the Lord your God, and Him only shall you worship. But here it mentions the four things about the Son of Man. First of all, in verse 13 it says He approached the throne of the Most High. In Exodus it says that nobody can, when Moses asks to see God, God says, "Nobody can see me and live." So how is this guy, this Son of Man, this human being, approaching the God's throne, unless he is sinless, right? So he has to be sinless in order to be in the presence of God. So that's a characteristic of God Himself, is being sinless. The second one is that it says, verse 14, He was given all authority. Basically, He was given the power to judge people about whether or not they will be brought into heaven or go to hell. And only God can be the judge. So He's given His Son the authority to be the judge, just like it says in Matthew 25, right? It says, "The Son of Man will return, and what shall He do? Separate the people as the sheep from the goats." Right? He's judging, right? So that's what Jesus is going to do. And then the third one is that it mentions that He is worshipped. Obviously, nobody should be worshipped except for God. So if this Son of Man character is being worshipped, He must be God. And the fourth is that His dominion will last forever. It will never pass away. So who is eternal but God, right? So this is an eternal quality. It's a divine quality. So it's also, the Messiah has to be God as well as human. Okay, that's we jumped all the way to the most important part of the book, but let's go at the beginning, and we'll start with interpretation of chapter 7, verse 1.
In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter.
Okay, so it tells us the first year of Belshazzar, as opposed to the end when he died. So some people believe this is at 553 BC, but it could have been closer to 550, which would have been a little bit later than that.
So is this Belshazzar's dream?
No, this is Daniel's dream. Yeah, so it says in the first year of Belshazzar. So what he does is he gives us a date to pin the vision to. A lot of the prophet, not a lot, but some prophets do this. For instance, like Zechariah talks about the visions he has, and he talks about they happened at night during a specific year of a certain king. So when it's done like this, it helps us to place it chronologically. But it's interesting because it's obvious that this chapter 7, had to have taken place before chapter 5. So why is he listed later? And I just gave you the reasons. It has to do with the arrangement of the book in order to highlight the important sections. Right? So this is part of a chiasm. And actually the ancient people wrote history with a purpose. Their goal was to give a meaning that they were trying to emphasize rather than being chronological. And I've talked about this before, that chronological history is a modern invention. It's not something that ancient people, first of all, they didn't have the luxury of being able to do it because they didn't have any way of identifying chronology with records, right? The only records they had were like written things. But, if I wrote something, sometimes people try to predate checks, but you can't prove when the check was written. Just because you say it was written, a couple days earlier or later than you actually wrote it doesn't mean anything. So you can't prove written documents. But with photographs and videos and computers and recordings and stuff like that, those things, even that sometimes today we can't prove those completely. But there's a lot more evidence. Like if I take a picture of a front page of a newspaper with the date on it, then the one thing you can say is that picture wasn't taken any time earlier than the date on the newspaper, because that newspaper didn't even exist until it was printed, right? And that's when they used to print newspapers. Nowadays, you can like make a fake newspaper online, a digital newspaper that could totally be faked. So that's one of the reasons why paper is still an important historical record.
So the timeline in my Bible says this is being written, chapter 7, in 553.
No, well, not necessarily written, but it takes place.
But then the first year of Belshazzar was subsequent to that, because it was 539 BC, I think. That's what my Bible says.
No, 539 is. I would say that the 539 is when the king capture of Babylon by King Cyrus of Persia.
Don't forget that 550 something that comes before 5.
Right, because it's the higher numbers are earlier, so it's counting down.
Okay.
So.
So Belshazzar came later, all the writing on the wall and stuff.
Belshazzar was
Right.
the
That
successor
came
of
up 14
Nebuchadnezzar.
years later.
Yeah. Okay, and so of course so in verse 1 it's mentioning the date of Belshazzar, so we can see when the dream took place, and it talks about how this dream passed through his mind as he was lying in his bed. It doesn't say he was asleep, even though it uses the word dream, but I think that in the Old Testament, a lot of times the word dream and vision they're synonyms for each other. And so the only way you can tell if a dream is when you're asleep is the context. So that's why he says that he actually uses both words here, though. And that's in the Aramaic. Maybe it's because there's no clear way of describing it unless you say both things. So he says, I had a dream and visions pass through his. Well, he's writing about himself in the third person. And actually, this is the first place in the book of Daniel that mentions Daniel as the writer. It says that he wrote down the substance of his dream. Why is he writing about himself in the third person? That's an interesting question. I mean, some people claim if it's in the third person, maybe he didn't write this. Maybe Daniel wasn't the real author. Somebody is writing about Daniel hundreds of years after the fact. And that's what a lot of the historical critical scholars will claim. And the reason why they'll say that he couldn't have written this is because it mentions things that didn't happen until much after his time. For instance, we'll talk about the...
Appointed prophecy, isn't it?
Yeah, right. The whole point of prophecy is that it sees the future. But historical critical scholars do not believe that prophecy can tell the future. They believe that it's always written after the fact as a way of trying to, explain something that already happened. Okay, but it says that he wrote these things down while he was lying on his bed. So he was awake, and so this is a vision. And who else had a vision while they were awake of the future? That's right. So this book is really the Old Testament version of the book of Revelation, because John also said, I was there standing, where was it? It was in Patmos, right? And he said, I saw these things, and he wrote them down. So he wrote his visions down, just like Daniel's writing his vision down. Okay, verse 2.
Daniel said, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea.
Okay. Well, and I'm not sure if I answered the question about why is Daniel writing about himself in the third person, except that I believe that that he's trying to. This is still in the Aramaic section, so it's more for the foreign governments, and so he's writing it kind of like in a more objective way, so that it could be given to the people who spoke that language. It's for the emperors of the Babylonian as well as the Persian empires, because he probably took some of the material from when Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree. I mean, he actually writes down the letter that Nebuchadnezzar wrote, and he worked for Nebuchadnezzar, so he maybe had access to it, so he just copied down. So, and he's still writing that way as in this section of Aramaic to make it more official. So he writes about himself in the third person. I think that it does change later on.
It changed right there.
What does he start using in verse 2? Does he start? Yeah, but he if you're writing in the third person though, you can say, and Daniel said, and then you write down what he said, and he uses I saw in my dream, right?
And it continues that way. Verse 1 reads like an introduction to a source document.
Right, and then so he's introducing his vision by writing about it in the third person, but then quoting himself in the first person.
Daniel wrote it down at the time, and this is what Daniel wrote. And then
Yeah.
from verse 2, it goes on with what Daniel wrote.
So, but the difference that I want to point out is that chapter 7 begins in the third person. But notice in chapter 8, it says, in the third year of King Belshazzar, I, Daniel, had a vision. So he doesn't say Daniel had a vision. He says I, Daniel, has a vision. So that's why chapter 7 is more of an official report to the rulers at the time, whereas once you get to chapter 8, which is in Hebrew language, and it's not necessarily something that the Persians would have understood. So it's not for them. So chapters 8 through 12 are in a different language, and it's not. And he includes it in the book because this is a book for God's people. But the first section, or the middle section that's in Aramaic, may have been, his way of trying to bring these foreign dignitaries to the knowledge of the true God. But when he gets to chapter 8 through 12, he's like, now this is for God's people. But then he just combined them in his prophecy and the scroll when he finished it, and that was around 539.
Writing in the third person continues the writing at the end of chapter 6 by King Darius.
Yeah, because
It refers to this Daniel.
yeah, that's because the middle section I think is supposed to be like that. Chapters 2 through 7 are for the foreign governments, and so he writes it in Aramaic. And he does get around that by making it in first person by quoting himself in this section that we just looked at. So, verse 2, Daniel said, in my vision at night I looked around. Now, he mentions the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. First of all, what are the four winds? What do you think that refers to?
North, south.
East and west. Very good. Yeah, exactly. Most commentators have come to the conclusion that all that is talking about the four cardinal directions of the earth. And so the four winds represent the 4 points on the compass, which just is a way of saying the whole world was being churned up. But it does describe the great sea. Now, the word there for sea is the word Yam, which is also a Canaanite god. So some people have tried to claim that he's basing this section on a Babylonian myth, right? And so the Babylonians talked about Yam was the god of the sea, like Neptune was the god of the sea for the Greeks, right? And so the god of the sea was to be feared because he was the god of chaos, the god of death, the god who, is unpredictable, and so you would make offerings because if you didn't, he would get mad at you and he would kill you as you're going on a boat or something like that. And so some people have tried to claim that, Daniel was just copying something that already was out there. Everybody knew about Yam and the Babylonian myths about the god of ocean and chaos and death. But, if that were true, then how come the only similarities between those myths and what the Bible says is just the name, right? Because he never claims that there's any type of there's no battle between good and evil in the Bible in general. The whole idea that there would be two types of gods, an evil god and a good god, they're kind of equally matched. That's dualism, right? Dualism is the idea that good and evil are equal, right? Does the Bible say anything about how good and evil react to each other? Are they equal? No. I mean, in Genesis, it says that God created everything good. There was no evil. Evil kind of snuck in. So the idea that the great churning of the sea was anything other than just a description of how this is a turmoil throughout the world is, I don't think there's a whole lot of evidence for that. It's simply a something that is noted by some scholars, and they try to make something of it. But I don't think he's going there. Because, when he does say that some of these things are coming up out of the sea, it does sound kind of like a crazy vision that may have some mythological connections. But I think that it's something that he uses language that the people at the time understood, right? I mean, people in America, we don't believe in Zeus, but if you mention Zeus, people know that he was the head of the pantheon of the Greek and Roman gods. And it's, we understand what that means, and those metaphors, if we talk about somebody like Zeus, then you're just saying that they're great and powerful.
Wasn't the Great Sea just the common way that the Mediterranean was referred to?
That's right. Sometimes they differentiated, like the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, by calling the other sea the Great Sea, which is the Mediterranean. Well, it's not the greatest sea because you go down to
It was to them.
yeah, but for them it was the Great Sea. So
Where they were living.
so
The
that
world was flat, so they didn't know about the other seas.
Well,
Maybe.
no, I don't think
but
that.
they just didn't live by it.
I don't think there's any evidence that the Bible does not teach that the world is flat. In fact, in Job it says that God suspends the earth on a string. So it's describing it like being suspended in space. I don't know if it uses the word ball, but it definitely does not call the earth flat. That's something that is actually only come around. There's people who kind of believed it throughout the centuries, but in the last 100 years, there's been this like anti-technology and anti-science movement that has embraced the flat Earth because it's an anti. You've heard of anti-Luddite? It's a people who are against technology.
Yes.
Yeah.
Luddite is
Yeah.
anti-technology.
Yeah, that's right. So anti-technology people embrace something that.
Oh, so Luddites say.
Yeah, right. So not. I saw something funny on a flat Earth website that says, "Flat Earth doctrine is taking the globe by storm." The people around the world are embracing it. So what? I thought you just said it was flat. So yeah, it's probably just he's not going into any details of Babylonian myths, but he is going to talk about stuff that is sounding pretty mythological. But we'll see that there's a purpose behind this in verse 3.
And 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another.
Okay, so he's just mentioning that this in his vision that the source of the beasts is the sea. So I think that if we recognize that for ancient people the ocean was a source of chaos and death, then obviously these 4 beasts are going to take on those characteristics. It's not like he's believing in the myths of the Babylonians, but he's using it as language they understood. Okay, so what are these animals? In verse 4.
First was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it.
Okay. Now remember, I mentioned how this chapter is parallel to which other chapter? Yep, chapter 2, right. So what we're going to try to do is identify how is the lion with wings like an eagle, like the first part of the statue. The statue of that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about. What was the head of the statue? Gold, right. And who did that represent?
Nebuchadnezzar.
That's right, Nebuchadnezzar himself. He was the head of gold. So this section here is talking about, but notice it talks about a lion with wings, and then the wings are gone, and then it's standing on its 2 feet like a man, and given the heart of a man. So what is that? Does that sound like that this kingdom is getting greater or getting weaker?
Yes.
Yeah, it's weaker, right? Well, I mean, if you're a lion with wings, you're pretty terrifying, and you can. Isn't there in Greek mythology they have a name for that? What's that called?
A lion with wings?
Griffin?
Griffin.
No, the griffin is eagle and lion hybrid. It has the head of an eagle, so it's not quite a griffin.
Oh, okay. So this is the Persian or the Babylonian version of a griffin, lion with wings. But anyways, the wings usually represent things that are that have speed, and usually the eagle in the Bible is a symbol for perception or intelligence because they can see far away, right? So the idea that you can see things that other people can't see, whether it's physically or perceptually, is a metaphor for intelligence. And also the wings represent speed and agility, being able to, that they were fast in building the empire. So let's look at some places in the Bible that represent these things. It's not like, you just take my word for it. Let's see, in Jeremiah 4, verse 7. Jeremiah 4:7.
Gone up from his thicket, a destroyer of nations has set out. He has gone out from his place to make your land a waste. Your cities will be ruins without inhabitant.
Okay, so Jeremiah is talking about which nation in chapter 4?
Babylon?
That's right. So Babylon is being described as a lion in verse 7. A lion has come out of his lair, a destroyer of nations is set out. So, the fact that previous prophets called Babylon a lion would not have been lost on the readers of this book of Daniel, knowing that, who is the lion? Well, it's probably Babylon. And then there's other places too. Another one's in chapter 50, verse 17. But let's move on to the eagle. Who is the eagle? Jeremiah 4, verse 13. 4, verse 13, the same chapter.
Behold, he comes up like clouds, his chariots like the whirlwind, his horses are swifter than eagles. Woe to us, for we are ruined.
Okay, well, maybe technically he doesn't say that Babylon is an eagle, but he says that he mentions his horses are swifter than eagles. And then Jeremiah 48, verse 40, also mentions the eagle.
The Lord says, look, an eagle is swooping down, spreading its wings over Moab.
Okay, so and this is the prophet Jeremiah talking about, it says concerning Moab, but he's talking about the nation of Babylon that is attacking and destroying all these countries as it's coming down from the north, right? So, they actually had to go along the Fertile Crescent because the middle of the Fertile Crescent is where Baghdad is today, and that is the city of Babylon. So they had to go north along the Tigris Euphrates rivers because you can't go straight across because that's where the desert is, and you'll die in the desert. So you go along the rivers, and then when you go up by Turkey, you hit the Mediterranean coastline, and you come straight down through Syria, Lebanon, and then Israel. And then, of course, you can go to the east of the Jordan, and then you can attack the countries over there, because Moab, Ammon, and Midian, the Midianites, so they all lived on the east side of the Jordan Plateau. And the Jordan Plateau is higher than the whole country of Israel, okay? Because Israel kind of goes up from the Mediterranean, and then it dives down a mile below sea level where the Dead Sea is, and it comes back up, and then the other side is higher. The Transjordan Plateau is like at 3,000 to 4,000 feet. Jerusalem is like 2,500 feet, and the Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level. So it drops way down and goes way back up. Babylon, throughout the book of Jeremiah, he's talking about, what Babylon is called to do. God called them to be the instrument to punish not only Israel, but all the nations because of their sinfulness. And then let's look at one other. Ezekiel 17, verse 3.
Starts at verse 2. Son of man, propound a riddle and speak a parable to the house of Israel. Verse 3. Say, thus says the Lord God, a great eagle with great wings and long pinions, rich in plumage of many colors, came to Lebanon and took the top of the cedar.
Okay, so So this is kind of a parable of the two eagles and a vine that Jeremiah gives. And when he mentions the Son of Man, God is talking to Ezekiel and calling him Son of Man, right? So it's a phrase that refers to what God's chosen. Like here is his prophet, and in the future it's going to be a description of God's chosen Messiah, Jesus. But it mentions the great eagle that comes down to Lebanon. Who is the great eagle? And because he comes down to Lebanon where the cedars are, and of course there's a temple that was made out of the cedars, and that represents Jerusalem.
Solomon.
So, but the great eagle would actually be because he's going to be attacking it and taking it over.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Right, Nebuchadnezzar. Right, so Nebuchadnezzar is described. So he's the king of Babylon at the time, and so when Daniel refers to the lion with the wings, especially a lion with wings, is a picture of Babylon at its height, at its greatest, right? When they're the fastest growing, and that was when Nabopolassar, which was the guy who started the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and then his son Nebuchadnezzar grew it from just a small country to a huge empire. And it happened really fast. And we go back to Daniel 7, and it says in the second verse of verse 4, I watched until its wings were torn off. So all of a sudden, it went from a great nation to a nation, a so-so nation that was no longer growing. And that was the time when Belshazzar and his father, I can't remember the name of him, but he was the one who left the city and let his son be in charge. And so they were definitely not growing. And in fact, it was the last days, because the Persian Empire was starting to grow so quickly that that's when we read about the story of Daniel chapter 5, where the Persian emperor and Darius comes into the city, and then they killed Belshazzar. Right? They didn't kill everybody else in the city. They just killed the king, and then they just took over the city. So it was pretty quick. And then the description where it says that he stood on the ground on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of man was given to him. So there's two ways of interpreting that. So it's looking at this empire being so great, like a wild animal, and then all of a sudden becoming like a man. That almost sounds like, remember the prophecy that we read about? I think that was chapter 5 as well, right? Chapter 5, where Nebuchadnezzar, or maybe it's, let's see, is it chapter 4? Yeah, it's chapter 4. Where Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and then he is humbled by God and becomes like a wild animal. Okay, so maybe the description in chapter 7 is talking about Nebuchadnezzar, where he was humbled, and then he finally acknowledged God, and then he was given the mind of a man. Some people think that that's what this is talking about. But if you're talking about how Nebuchadnezzar was kind of like the lion with the wings, and then his grandson Belshazzar was kind of like he only had the human qualities, right? Because he was no longer as powerful. Then maybe it's just talking about him. So I don't know if it would make a difference, because either way, if it's just talking about Nebuchadnezzar's change from being great to being humbled by God, or the nation itself being a great nation to becoming a so-so nation, 3 generations later, in the 3rd generation, it still means the same thing. It could be both as well. And I don't think it really changes the interpretation of the text. At the end of this chapter, Daniel's going to tell us, he won't go, he doesn't give us some of the explanations as obvious as we might want, but we can. If you look ahead, when he talks about the interpretation of the dream, you can see what he mentions. If you look at verse 23, I'm sorry. Let's see. Oh, because he's talking about the 4th beast in that section there. Yeah, so Daniel, in his interpretation of these beasts, he says, verse 18, the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess it forever. I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast. So he spends most of his interpretation talking about the fourth beast and doesn't necessarily mention who the kings are of the other three countries. And so I think that at the time it was written, it was pretty obvious, right? Because we just saw that many of the prophets already mentioned that Babylon was like a lion and like an eagle, okay? And then, obviously it was strong at one time, and then it got weaker. Okay, so let's go on to verse 5 of chapter 7.
And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, Arise, devour much flesh.
Okay, so who is a bear? Who is like a bear? Okay, so if we look at chapter 8, verse 3, because chapter 7 and chapter 8 are going to give us the same kind of vision. I mean, they're 2 different visions, but they're the same thing, right? Just like Daniel chapter 2 talked about the 4 kingdoms, Daniel chapter 7 talks about 4 kingdoms, Daniel chapter 8 is the 3rd cycle of the same 4 kingdoms. So that's why if we look at chapter 8, verse 3, it says, I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. Okay, so if that is the same as the vision of the bear, then we know that it's talking about a kingdom or an empire that has like 2 parts to it, right? Just like there's the ram with 2 horns. And so what nation is represented by 2 empires that came together? That's right, the Medes and the Persians. Yeah, and the reason why it's important to recognize that it's talking about a 2-part kingdom is that, sure, there was a time when the Medes ruled by themselves, and then the Persians took them over, but it was more like that they kind of melded together, and that was because Darius was... Darius was called the king of the Medes, but he also is the same person as Cyrus, who was the Persian emperor, and we know that his mother was a Mede and his father was a Persian. So, and he kind of took over that empire, without having to kill a lot of people. Although I think that there was some assassinations of family members in order for this to happen. But showing that this is a 2-part empire is important, because if it is only, let's say that the bear represents the Mede Empire, that means that the 3rd beast, which is the leopard, would represent the Persians. And what that does is it shifts the whole future prophecy to an earlier setting, because if the 3rd beast is the Persian Empire, then the 4th beast has to be the Greeks, right? And that means that the Romans aren't even part of the picture. But throughout Christian history, Christian interpretation of this has been that the 4th Empire has to be Rome, because it's in the coming of the Messiah that this final empire is going to be defeated. And the reason why some scholars want to interpret it as that the 4 beasts in this section here represent the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks is because they don't want to admit that Daniel had the ability to see that far into the future. And so what they want to say is, Daniel wrote this at the end of the Greek Empire. And so he was just looking back and just summarizing what already had happened. And because there's no way, everybody knows for sure that Daniel was written before 200 BC, which is before the Romans came in. So if Daniel was finished before 200, and he is talking about the Romans, then he is a true prophet. And that's the problem that a lot of these historical critical scholars reject, that prophecy cannot predict the future. So if they believe that, then they have to change their interpretation to get rid of any idea of Romans. Romans can't be in here because he couldn't have known about them. But if, and so I think that, Daniel is being pretty clear here. The bear, how is the bear like, how how is there two parts of the bear? It says, before me the second beast looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides. So he's doing his best to talk about a single empire, but he's talking about there's two sides of this empire, right? The bear has two sides. Why does he even mention this detail in the first place? Unless he's talking about a two-sided empire. And then it says some people might say, well, you're splitting hairs here, or it doesn't seem like that's really what it's talking about. But I think that detail is irrelevant, that the bear was raised up on one of its implied two sides. Why is that there? The only reason for this detail to be there is because he wants us to know that the Medes and the Persians are what he's talking about here. And you could say, well, why doesn't he just say the Medes and the Persians? Well, because he's writing at a time when the Medes and the Persians actually did exist. And if they think he's writing about them, then they may execute him. Same thing that happened during the time of John in the book of Revelation. Why doesn't John simply say the Romans are the great Satan? Because if he said that, he would have been executed. As it was, he was put into prison on the island of Patmos. So he writes, when Daniel writes his book, as well as when John wrote his Apocalypse, he wrote it in symbolic language that would have been most appropriate to be understood by God's people. It was kind of like written in hidden language so that the people that it's writing about wouldn't understand it. They would just say, what are you guys talking about? You Israelites are crazy. We don't like you guys. But if they thought that they were saying something about the country that they were in that was derogatory, they might have, burned the books, kept them from sharing it with people because it would have been seen as propaganda. Okay, so if the Persian and the Medes and the Persians are the bear, then what are the three ribs in its mouth?
Can we go back on that?
Oh, sure.
Explain the chest and the arms then. I know what it's supposed to be, but how?
Because when you compare it with the vision of the statue in chapter 2, the silver arms represent the Medes and the Persians. So it's two parts, right?
The chest?
Well, the chest is in between the arms, right? So it's just this taking this cross section. So it's talking about the two arms with the chest in between. So you're having the part of the statue that has two sections on it, which is referring to the Medes and the Persians. And so, is there anything about the Persian Empire or the Mede-Persian Empire that they attacked and destroyed, or at least had a battle with three so-called ribs? Right, the ribs represent something.
Rulers of Babylon.
So they could represent just the rulers of Babylon, but I think that they actually represent three different victories that the Persians were able to accomplish. And then, we can check in history. And one of the things about the battles that the Persians had, or the Medes and the Persians had with other nations, is that there are three huge battles that were recorded in history. So that would include the battle of the Medes and the Persians against a city named Lydia, right? Lydia is I think it's in Asia Minor. It talks about how Paul, in his travels, was up in there. So in 547 BC, the Mede-Persian Empire destroyed the city of Lydia. And then the next one was the destruction of the city of Babylon, which, we read about in chapter 6, or no, it was chapter 5. In chapter 5, when the city was taken over by the Persians. And that was in 539. And then the last one was the one I mentioned about how, I don't know if we mentioned it anywhere else in this book so far, but it's the Persian Empire attacked and defeated Egypt in 525. So those are probably, at least that's what a lot of scholars believe is the symbolism of the three ribs, is those three victories by the Persian Empire. For the people reading this at this time, they would have known these things, but for us, we don't necessarily Remember those? I mean, they're so far back in history. So we kind of lose what the meaning is specifically, but we understand that this is an empire that is vicious, right? If they're tearing up their enemies, because it says that the word of the vision is it was told. Notice it's passive, right? So the bear nation is told. So who did the telling? Who's commanding the Persian Empire to do its work? God is. God's in control. So whenever you see the passive voice, that means that God is the one who's doing the action. God's the one who commanded Persia, and he was leading them to punish Babylon for their arrogance. I mean, even way back in the book of Isaiah, it says that God was going to punish Babylon for their arrogance. He was going to. Isaiah says, "I saw Babylon fall like a star from the sky," and that's a reference where we get the word Lucifer, the morning star, and all that stuff. Those passages about the devil are really passages about Babylon, because Babylon becomes a symbol for evil. That's why in the book of Revelation, the great Babylon is the Antichrist, or the enemy of God's people, and it's patterned after all the arrogance of the Babylonians, and God said he would punish them. So this empire is going to get up and eat your fill of flesh. It's just a vicious description. And the battles of the Persian Empire against the Babylonians, they didn't just, obviously didn't just take over the Babylonian Empire, but we know that their most vicious battles were against other countries. So those battles I just mentioned to you, Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt, were 3 huge battles where thousands of people died, but Persia was victorious. Of course, that since he's writing this during the time of the Persian Empire, you might say, well, why is he trying to hide it? It sounds like he's being complimentary to him. Until you get to the next one. We'll probably have to do this next week, in verse 7, where he talks about in verse 6, which is the third beast. But we'll stop here. And any final questions? Okay, so if you want to read towards the end of the chapter, we'll be ready for this section. So next week we'll start with the third beast in verse 6.